We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that he admires it intensely. All art is quite useless.
No one has ever written, painted, sculpted, modeled, built, or invented, except literally to get out of hell. Antonin Artaud. I'm going to tell you about a man. A man whom some regarded as a madman, and who, at times, embraced the label himself. A man who moved regularly in and out of sanatoriums and detox programs, who spent years of his life in involuntary psychiatric care and emerged from his last almost decade-long stay looking corpse-like and toothless. A man who briefly believed that he was the Roman Emperor Heliogabalus, who had been assassinated as a teenager 17 centuries earlier. A man who wrote a truly scabrous letter to the Pope, calling the pontiff a dog, insisting that his Roman masquerade was the hatred of all immediate truths of the soul, and vowing to wage war on the church and to shit on its canons. A man who somehow caught on to, or simply made up, a conspiracy theory in which the U.S. government was collecting and storing the semen of American boys upon their entry into the public school system to be used for artificial insemination in the future production of soldiers. A theory expressed, in fact, in the very recording, made months before his death, that you hear playing in the background right now. A man who believed that the soul took the form of a literal fluid inhabiting the body. Who believed that the demiurge, a Gnostic conception of a small g creator god, had taken over his body so that the demiurge could be born at the expense of his own assassination. A man who stressed the importance of the body as the seat of emotion, adopting a yogic use of the breath by which transcendence could be achieved through physical stimuli and exercise, but who also reviled the bodily organs and imagined remaking the human form as a body without organs. A man who insisted, in a letter to one of his doctors, that human beings had originally been created by God with neither sexual organs nor a digestive system, eliminating food by a process he called lumbar evaporation, and that both digestion and sex were the work of the devil. A man who, after a radical and seemingly earnest conversion to Christianity, insisted that he wielded the stick of Christ and was being commanded by Christ in his actions. Who believed that the police were putting people under spells and taking their sperm through ritual masturbation, and that his confinement in a hospital was the work of the Antichrist and his agents, begging for doses of opium as the drug was the antidote to eroticism and the spells of the demon, and that to refuse him opium amounted to being an accomplice of the devil. A man who, while living in a psychiatric facility, demanded that he be sent heroin as a defense against the initiates who were torturing and mutilating him from afar each night, who claimed that the Bohemian troops for the coming reign of the other world were trying to enter our world and that he needed heroin to open the hidden doors for them and to break the spells of Satan, which kept them out and kept him prisoner, but who later refused to leave the same facility, fearing he would lose his magical powers as a result. A man who, for a time, wielded a magical cane he believed to have been the cane of St. Patrick, only to lose it in a scuffle with the police after he tried to gain entry to a Dublin monastery in the middle of the night. A man who believed there was an occult conspiracy casting spells on geniuses the likes of Baudelaire, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Van Gogh, and Coleridge. Who, for the last several years of his life, insisted that he was dead, and that his body continued on only as a vessel for God to occupy after it had been purified. A man who was obsessed, if you couldn't tell by now, by outlandish fantasies, who vacillated wildly between contradictory positions, who failed repeatedly in his professional endeavors, and who was, by many accounts, one of the greatest artistic minds of the 20th century. A man who, if he was a madman, may also have been a kind of prophet. I'm Greg Beam, and this is quite useless.
Une fois pour toutes, et honteusement, la place à tous les triomphaux produits de remplacement.
Welcome to Quite Useless, a podcast about art and its role in our lives. In the last episode, I introduced Plato's allegory of the cave, asking if art may be used to accomplish something similar to the path described by Socrates in that story. Specifically, I explored the notion of 20th century playwright Bertolt Brecht as an example of an artist who tried to do just this. That is, first to free himself from delusion, by breaking down the mechanisms of his subjugation. In Brecht's mind, this was the machinery of capitalism. And then using his art to try to similarly enlighten others and equip them to escape from their own subjugation. In the world of 20th century drama, Brecht was by no means alone in attempting to awaken his audience from their benighted condition. We could, in fact, describe the whole modern history of European drama, much more than American drama, I would say, as a series of efforts to dispel illusion, to shine a light on the darkness that pervades our lives as individuals and as social beings, to run roughshod over the paltry parlor dramas, the domesticated and domesticating entertainments that had typified the European stage for much of the previous century, and to produce work that exposed the various forces, psychological, political, and existential, that effected our subjugation. As early as the 1870s, Henrik Ibsen began penning works of social realism and parody that held a mirror up to the injustices and hypocrisies of bourgeois society, most notably in his scandalous play A Doll's House. In that drama, the main character gets a rude awakening about her ignorance to her own subjugation and, in a turn reminiscent of Plato, escapes from the cave of her middle-class home to pursue a genuine education. Decades later, Eugene Ionesco would shed his own parodic light on the confusions and inanities of modern social existence, writing gonzo works that reflected the absurdity of modern linguistic and cultural conventions. This penchant for highlighting various absurdities of the human condition was shared by many of Ionesco's contemporaries, eventually representing the loosely defined genre dubbed theater of the absurd by Martin Esslin. The genre's granddaddy, Alfred Jarry, lampooned the arbitrariness and inanity of political power in Ubu Roy. Jean Genet was likewise fascinated by power dynamics, though of a more erotic and violent variety. And the category's most famous practitioner, Samuel Beckett, not content to point out the absurdity of this or that aspect of human life, gave us stark dramas about the basic absurdity of the human situation. How we ceaselessly yearn for a metaphysical foundation to ground our being, a transcendent source of meaning to give our lives value, only to come up against the silence of a neutral, godless universe. There's one aspect of Plato's allegory of the cave, though, that I kind of glossed over before. The moment when the awakened person ventures back into the cave to tell their compatriots what they've discovered, only to be regarded as a lunatic, a nutjob, a madman. Bertolt Brecht, the subject of the previous episode, never fit this profile. For all his barking and bravado, his elaborate eccentricities and quarrels with collaborators and critics alike, no one ever suggested he was insane, just passionate. Even the somewhat schizoid rift between his public and private moralities was met with relative equanimity by those close to him. His wife and collaborator, Helene Weigel, speaking about Brecht's reputation for infidelity, commented that he was loyal, just to too many people. Antonin Artaud was another story altogether. A mostly unsuccessful theater director, Artaud's striking face is somewhat recognizable from his appearances as an actor, notably as the young monk in Carl Dreyer's silent film classic The Passion of Joan of Arc. But he's best remembered for his poetry and essays, which express and embody a distinctive view of aesthetics and human culture. He is known, that is, for his views on art and its role in our lives. Not a bad fit for this podcast. While he was interested in poetry and painting and other art forms, Artaud's theories focused principally on the theater. He proposed a root and branch break from tradition, even more radical than anything Brecht envisioned. But he didn't stop at articulating an evocative vision of what live performance could and should accomplish in society. He took his project more personally, putting ideas into practice in his own life. His theories were so vivid and electric that, in spite of Artaud's own professional failures, they inspired a whole generation of theater makers who followed him and continue to reverberate in live performance today. But his behavior was so erratic and extreme that those close to him regularly questioned his sanity. Born in Marseille, France in 1896, Artaud's life was marked by illness and difficulty from an early age. Out of 9 children born to his mother, only 3 survived childhood, and in Antonin's case, just barely. He contracted meningitis when he was 5 and emerged from a days-long coma with his body ravaged. He suffered his first of a number of mental breakdowns at the age of 19, and by his mid-20s had begun taking laudanum, one of several substances he would be addicted to throughout his too short life. But rather than seeing his psychiatric woes as a set of conditions from which he ought to recover, Artaud embraced his divergent personality and worldview, regarding what others called madness as markers of his capacity to see beyond the oppressive veil of convention. In his late essay, Van Gogh, the Man Suicided by Society, Artaud makes a passionate and poetic case for the view of the artistic genius as a person whose vision and vitality so transcend the faculties of common people that they can't be viewed as anything but a lunatic. And what is an authentic madman? Artaud asks. It is a man who preferred to become mad in the socially accepted sense of the word, rather than forfeit a certain superior idea of human honor. There is in every madman a misunderstood genius, Artaud tells us, whose idea, shining in his head, frightened people, and for whom delirium was the only solution to the strangulation that life had prepared for him. Then, predicting the work of French philosopher Louis Althusser on repressive state apparatuses, he goes on, "So society has strangled in its asylums all those it wanted to get rid of or protect itself from, because they refused to become its accomplices in certain great nastinesses. For a madman is also a man whom society did not want to hear, and whom it wanted to prevent from uttering certain intolerable truths. It is not a certain conformity of manners that the painting of Van Gogh attacks, but rather the conformity of institutions themselves." In Artaud's view, psychiatry was a perverted institution meant to suppress mental and spiritual flourishing in the service of social regulation. He comments with particular venom about psychiatrists themselves. "It is almost impossible to be a doctor and an honest man," he writes, "but it is obscenely impossible to be a psychiatrist without at the same time bearing the stamp of the most incontestable madness, that of being able to resist that old atavistic reflex of the mass of humanity, which makes any man of science who is absorbed by this mass a kind of natural and inborn enemy of all genius." And just to make sure the reader understands that he is speaking from personal experience, he adds, "I myself spent 9 years in an insane asylum, and I never had the obsession of suicide. But I know that each conversation with the psychiatrist, every morning at the time of his visit, made me want to hang myself, realizing that I would not be able to cut his throat." It wasn't just that the orientations and actions of mad geniuses like himself were abhorrent to the clenched fist minds of psychiatrists. It was that Artaud and his ilk represented a real danger to the dominant social order. He writes, "It is thus that the few rare, lucid, well-disposed people who have had to struggle on the earth find themselves at certain hours of the day or night in the depth of certain authentic and waking nightmare states, surrounded by the formidable suction, the formidable tentacular oppression of a kind of civic magic which will soon be seen appearing openly in social behavior." In Artaud's view, there was something deeply out of joint in modern society, and psychiatry was one of its most poignant reflections. Like Brecht, he railed against the deadening impact of bourgeois values on art and culture. But for Artaud, the problem wasn't just capitalism. He broke with his surrealist compatriots when they yoked their artistic efforts to the aims of the Communist Party. Artaud saw communism, as he saw every great modern ideology, as yet another expression of the pathological rationalism that was choking the human mind and spirit, cutting us off from the true wellsprings of our mental and emotional vitality. Brecht was nothing if not rational in his approach to the struggle with modernity, and Artaud viewed this as taking one side of an artificial dichotomy and thereby accepting the terms of the whole. To take a side in the modern ideological struggle meant to endorse the existence of that struggle. Artaud rejected it at every level. As Martin Esslin puts it, Artaud maintained that political action was useless, and true revolution could come only by a transformation of the human consciousness and spirit from within. Artaud believed that the true purpose of theater was to help enact this inner transformation. Which leads us to his most famous, influential, and misunderstood concept, the theater of cruelty. In his first book, The Birth of Tragedy, Friedrich Nietzsche describes the countervailing impulses of ancient drama in terms of the rational or Apollonian and ecstatic or Dionysian. These forces, though superficially opposed, exist in balance with and support one another in a perpetual cosmic dance, rather like the Eastern notions of yin and yang. Later in his life, reacting to the ills of his own age, Nietzsche would express a preference for the Dionysian. Artaud, who adored Nietzsche, took up this mantle a generation later. Like Brecht, Artaud objected to the comfortable illusions peddled by the popular theater of his era, but instead of a discursive approach that would encourage the spectator to think critically about the issues and ideas raised in the drama, Artaud wanted to put on shocking spectacles that would forcefully yank the audience out of their spiritual complacence. He envisioned a theater in which violent physical images crush and hypnotize the sensibility of the spectator, seized by the theater as by a whirlwind of higher forces. If Brecht was the clear-eyed, sober Apollo of the modern theater, Artaud was its wild-eyed, intoxicated Dionysus. In his vision, gestures, sounds, unusual scenery, and lighting combine to form a language superior to words that can be used to subvert thought and logic and to shock the spectator into seeing the baseness of his world. The role of language is critical here. Artaud was a brilliant poet and essayist, but he viewed conventional language as a social and psychological hazard. If rationalism was the great oppressor, then conventional language was the principal tool of its enforcement. Reflecting the approach of structuralist linguists and philosophers, as well as the emerging field of semiotics, Artaud wanted to replace verbal language with systems of visual signs and symbols and gestures, reserving vocalization for visceral expressions of feeling. All true language is incomprehensible, he tells us, like the chatter of a beggar's teeth. At around the same time that Artaud was active, philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein invoked a metaphor similar to Plato's allegory of the cave. He said his aim as a philosopher was to show the fly the way out of the bottle. Bertolt Brecht's approach to this task was to engage the fly in lively discourse and to persuade him to follow the way to the opening of the bottle and out into the air. Artaud favored a more direct approach. Smash the bottle and let the fly go free. Roughed up and stunned, but liberated. Artaud no doubt wanted to challenge and even to threaten his audience. Destroy yourselves, you who are desperate, he commands in the essay General Security, the Liquidation of Opium. And you who are tortured in body and soul, abandon all hope. There is no more solace for you in this world. The world lives off your rotting flesh. But his aim wasn't to damage the viewer, but to liberate them. In the first chapter of his opus, The Theater and Its Double, in which he introduces his concept of the theater of cruelty, he warns that we are not free, and the sky can still fall on our heads, And the theater has been created to teach us that first of all. The theater he proposed was dangerous, but it would serve as a corrective and protection against the greater danger presented by an ordinary life, the danger that we are rendered insensible to the hazards of the world. Lee Jameson in Antonin Artaud From Theory to Practice explains that Artaud sought to remove aesthetic distance, bringing the audience into direct contact with the dangers of life. By turning theater into a place where the spectator is exposed rather than protected, Artaud was committing an act of cruelty upon them. But I think this term, theater of cruelty, may contribute to mistakes about Artaud's aims, and I'm not alone in this view. Some of his close colleagues encouraged him to adopt another name for his idea. It places a misleading emphasis on the brutality and ugliness of the work Artaud was proposing. However cruel in the means of its application, the act was ultimately one of generosity. While shocking images and sounds and scenes that were difficult to behold were certainly features of the work, the intention was not simply to rub the audience member's face in all manner of unpleasantness. It was to awaken them. Artaud's aim wasn't to leave people damaged. He wanted them to be restored, shattered by the immediate experience, perhaps, but with the seeds of rebirth planted in them. Artaud was deeply interested in theater's ritual and even sacred potential. He viewed the performer as something akin to the shamans and medicine men of traditional societies, enacting the direct transmission of spiritual goods to the spectator. He imagined what he described as communion between actor and audience in a magic exorcism. While that sounds a bit out there may be some sound psychological and physiological insights in play here. Professor Ted Kapchick of Harvard Medical School has written about how the theatrical and ritual dimensions of doctor-patient interactions contribute to the potency of the placebo effect, which he argues is one of the most powerful phenomena in medicine. Why shouldn't a similar principle apply to the dispensing of emotional and spiritual medicine? Some schools of meditation, for instance, notably the TM school, stress the importance of working with a qualified teacher. It isn't that the mechanics of the practice can't be learned on one's own, but the presence of someone playing the role of a designated guide invokes a heightened state of receptivity. Artaud understood the psychological potency of theatrical performance, and he wanted to produce immersive theatrical events outside of conventional theater spaces, where there would be no divide between performer and spectator, everyone occupying the same space and partaking of the sacred fruit of the performance. For Artaud, engagement with this new kind of performance wasn't aimed only at personal transformation. He sought a rebirth of society, a return to forgotten sacred connections, with theater as the principal means of reforging these connections. There is something about this picture that I find immensely appealing. I feel in my own life a longing for reconnection with a lost heritage, for a cultural rebirth. I doubt that I'm alone in experiencing a generalized feeling of estrangement, a lack of cultural roots. Contemporary Western society, I would say especially in America, is a composite, synthetic creation. I am aware of my ethnic background, where my ancestors came from. I share with Artaud a largely French heritage, by way of Quebec in my case. But though I'm sure it'll sadden my mom when she listens to this, I feel no meaningful connection with this lineage. I don't think I would feel noticeably different about my identity if my bloodline were largely Scottish, as my wife's is. Now, please understand that I'm not trying to falsely paint myself as somehow marginalized as a function of my lack of a native culture. I am well aware of the privilege wrapped up in being a 30-something white guy in America. But I do at times feel like a cultural orphan. And I'm willing to bet that a lot of people out there, across a lot of different ethnic backgrounds, feel something similar. I think that's a big reason that many of us gravitate toward the arts. In the absence of an organic culture, we need art to engender a sense of connection to something genuine and complex and human, and to provide us, well, I was going to say with a sense of meaning, but it's more with the structures and systems that allow us to create and recognize meaning in our lives. Jacques Derrida would probably take me to task for this proposition, as it idealizes traditional cultures in a way that he considered one half of an illusory ethnocentric binary. Derrida thought that all people throughout history have experienced the feeling of estrangement I'm describing, that to live in a culture is to experience alienation from the model picture of that culture, and that the idea of a more innocent past from which we have fallen is pure bunk. Maybe he's right. Evidence of institutional corruption, alienation, and nostalgia for a supposedly pure before time can be found dating back to the ancient literature of both East and West. It's right there in the Tao Te Ching and the 2,000-year-old writings of Zhuangzi, which I discussed in the first episode of this season. But even if that is the case, even if there is nothing uniquely denatured or perverted in the modern age, this doesn't alter the spiritual ailment that Artaud is diagnosing, or invalidate his prescription for its treatment. As human beings, we crave, we need, a conceptual and emotional matrix within which to organize our sense of meaning, value, purpose. And if this matrix isn't provided by birth or upbringing, we will seek it out. Culture itself can be regarded as a kind of collective artistic creation, one that we rely upon to organize our values and worldviews and to make the perception of meaning possible. If we aren't born into a culture that provides these functions, we'll invent one. The 1990 documentary Paris is Burning provides a vivid portrait of just this phenomenon. Revolving around the drag balls of 1980s New York, the film shows how its subjects, the city's dispossessed gay men and transgender women, forged a whole cultural system complete with complex modes of association and identification. They synthesized a culture with its own ethical and aesthetic properties, one with a hefty performative element.
You know, you have to have something to offer in order to lead. The mother usually becomes the mother because she's usually the best one out of the group.
I'm Willie Ninja, the mother of the house of Ninja.
Give him what he wants!
I'm the mother of the house of Ninja because they say I'm the best voter out. To be the mother of the house, you have to have the most power. Take a real family. It's the mother that's the hardest worker, and the mother gets the most respect. As far as my naming my house, the house of Ninja, ninjas hit hard, they hit fast. An invisible assassin, and that's what we are. We come out to assassinate.
Along with generating terms that filtered out into the larger society, yass and shade and voguing, the way the figures in the film engage in their acts of immersive theater serves as a contemporaneous illustration of the gender theories being developed at the time by philosophers like Judith Butler. The drag balls are more than shows. They help to establish social roles and relationships, to define and solidify the culture they all rely on to give order and meaning to their lives. These balls are not just parties. They are sacred rituals, akin to going to church, with audience and performer acting as mutual participants, just as Artaud had envisioned. Artaud never had any real success as an actor, director, or playwright, apart from some noteworthy performances on film, a medium he held in disdain. Whatever bracing midnight clarity was given to his perception, the direct experience of it remained mostly with the man himself. Fitting, perhaps, for someone who declared his highest artistic ambition to be the feat of making a tragedy of his own life. A generous reading of his years in psychiatric care, from which he emerged gaunt and toothless, his chronic struggles with addiction and his untimely death, would say that he succeeded in this, at least. But although Artaud was particularly eccentric and radical, his theories were not without their corollaries in the modern theater. A rather more successful artist whose ideas were in line with Artaud, though Artaud didn't seem to have been a direct influence on him, was the Polish director and acting teacher Jerzy Grotowski. Grotowski had established himself as a major figure of the European avant-garde before coming to the US, where he taught for a time at the University of California, Irvine. Now, I got my MFA from Irvine, and several of my professors had worked or studied with Grotowski during his tenure in the 80s. My movement classes in grad school were held in a magical little building at the edge of campus, lovingly nicknamed the Grotowski Barn. Like Artaud, Grotowski saw the theatrical event as a sacred ritual. He sought a purifying moment of contact between actor and spectator, achieved through the channeling of primordial energies and the stripping away of all artifice. If you want to create a masterpiece, Grotowski wrote, you must always avoid beautiful lies. Like Artaud, he rejected the pandering impulses of popular theater, cinema, and, by the time Grotowski was prominent, television. The spectator likes easy truths, he observed, but we are not there to please or pander to the spectator. We are here to tell the truth. Grotowski's work habits were legendary. He would have his actors convene before dawn and push them for hours to the brink of exhaustion, practices intended like intense yoga or meditation to break apart and dissolve the ego, the illusory individual identity, and to expose the true self, the self with a capital S. The archetypal image of Western drama is a pair of masks, one tragic and one comic, to be donned by the performer. Grotowski sought the opposite, the shedding of all masks, of anything contrived or extraneous or phony. Why do we sacrifice so much energy to our art? He asks. His answer, not in order to teach others, but to learn with them what our existence, our organism, our personal and repeatable experience have to give us. To learn to break down the barriers which surround us, and to free ourselves from the brakes which hold us back, from the lies about ourselves which we manufacture daily for ourselves and for others. To destroy the limitations caused by our ignorance or lack of courage. In short, to fill the emptiness in us. To fulfill ourselves. Art is a ripening, an evolution, an uplifting which enables us to emerge from darkness into a blaze of light. Art is a ripening, an evolution, an uplifting which enables us to emerge from darkness into a blaze of light. I kind of wish Grotowski had been around in Plato's time. He might have given him second thoughts about expelling poets from his perfect republic. There is a notion in Christian ascetic traditions of something called the fool for Christ, or holy fool. A saintly person who exhibits wildly deviant behavior, who eschews societal norms, delivers prophecies, and shocks the sensibilities of those around them, but all to expose the absurdities of convention and to speak truth to power. Perhaps one of our fundamental problems today is that we have reserved no space for the holy fool. Our various institutions either marginalize or demonize, medicate or domesticate these figures. This is what Artaud seemed to think. He wrote with the incandescent fury of an Old Testament prophet, but in the 20th century was committed for much of his life to psychiatric care. It may be that we have lost our appreciation for the potency, the vitalizing force these figures can bring to us. We fear them. We wish to make them small. And our ever more refined systems of social regulation make it ever more efficient for us to rob them of their power. Khalil Gibran, himself a powerful artist who towed the edge of the abyss, wrote, "I shall be happy when men shall say about me what they said of Blake. He is a madman. Madness in poetry is wisdom. Madness in the search for good is the highest form of worship." Gibran's biographer, Barbara Young, wrote of the author and his ilk, "There is a race of strangers, of wayfarers, that persists upon the earth. They dwell with us a while, calling us brothers, but we come to be aware that they are of an immortal stuff, somewhat more deific than ourselves. And only insofar as we receive and comprehend their utterance, only inasmuch as we join our unwavering, uncertain voices with their voice, may we partake in brief and finite measure of their communion. At this exact historical moment, it may seem that our greatest threat is that we may be lapsing into unreason and mass hysteria. But should more reasonable, progressive, and humane forces prevail, as I hope they will, what a shame it would be if it came at the cost of muzzling our holy fools. What a cruel fate it would be if we were to cleanse our society of every trace of madness. This episode of Quite Useless was written, recorded, produced, performed, mixed, and mastered by me, Greg Beam. I also made the music. You can find every episode of Quite Useless on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the website, thisisquiteuseless.com, or wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe, download, enjoy. I hate to ask this because I hate it when other people ask this, but whether you're a new or an old listener, if you could take just one moment to drop a rating or brief review on Apple Podcasts, that would be amazing. Even if that's not the service you use, it's the service that most people use, and so it's kind of the most useful one to get feedback on. This show has a small but mighty audience, which I would love to expand into, like a mid-sized and even mightier audience. I've also set up a Patreon account, and there's a donation button on the website, thisisquiteuseless.com. I have no ambitions to make any kind of serious money off of this enterprise. It truly is a labor of love. I share things that I find fascinating, that I hope will mildly fascinate you as well. But if you could help me a little bit to offset the cost of production, it would be most appreciated. In case you didn't catch it at the beginning, this episode is the second in a sequence inspired by Plato's Republic. Tune in for the next installment when I'll be inverting the usual formula for this podcast. Instead of looking at the philosophy of art, I'll be looking at the art of philosophy. I'm Greg Beam, and I very much hope you'll join me for more mad, immersive, and always quite useless adventures.